June 19th, 1944, 15 degrees north latitude, 135 degrees east longitude, Philippine Sea. Lieutenant Commander Zenji Abe, Air Group Commander aboard carrier Zuikaku, stood in his cockpit as his Mitsubishi A6M Zero fighter rolled down the flight deck. The sea breeze whipped against his canopy, and the horizon shimmered with heat and salt. The launch officer's flag snapped downward. Abe pushed the throttle forward. The Zero shuddered, then surged ahead, wheels rattling against steel as the carrier pitched gently in the Pacific swell. In seconds, he was airborne. He banked sharply into the sun and joined the massive rising flock of aircraft assembling overhead. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 373 aircraft filled the sky above Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's mobile fleet. Every operational carrier in the Imperial Japanese Navy had launched its entire striking force. Dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and fighters circled in layered formations like swarms of metallic insects shimmering in the morning light. The sight was breathtaking, majestic even. From the cockpit, Abe could see the wakes of the carriers below, slicing through deep blue water, their flight decks busy with the next wave of launches and recovery operations. He had flown many missions in his career. He had seen Pearl Harbor's smoke clouds rising behind him. He had strafed Darwin. He had fought at Coral Sea and escaped Midway's fiery wreckage. In 7 years of carrier warfare, he had never seen so many Japanese naval aircraft in the air at once. And yet, something felt wrong. The formation was impressive, but not complete. The air crews were too young. Too many fresh faces in too many cockpits. Too many experienced pilots missing. Too many voices over the radio speaking nervously, uncertainly. The once razor-sharp fighting edge of the Kido Butai, the famed carrier striking force of 1941, was blunted now. Replaced by hurriedly trained pilots who knew how to fly but had barely learned how to fight. Below, the Japanese carriers still gleamed with precision and elegance. Their decks were neat, orderly, immaculate as always. Aircraft were moved below for refueling and arming, protected by enclosed hangars and carefully coiled fuel lines. Maintenance was exact. Procedures were precise. Everything worked on paper. But war did not happen on paper. Across the horizon, beyond detection, beyond visibility, American carriers lurked. Massive Essex-class flat-tops, as numerous as they were battle-hardened. Their decks were not immaculate. Their aircraft were crammed wingtip to wingtip under the sun. Their crews rushed. Their decks looked chaotic. But that chaos worked. It allowed faster launch cycles, quicker refueling, larger air wings. Their fighters flew with radar guidance. Their pilots were rested, experienced, rotated home and back through rigorous training pipelines. Their ships carried more fuel, more bombs, more spare parts, more everything. Abe could not see them. He could only feel their presence. As his formation reached altitude, he listened to the chatter in his earphones. Some of the younger pilots had never landed on a carrier at sea. Some had never fired their guns in combat. Many did not know how to use formation flying under live enemy contact. Abe felt a weight in his stomach, not fear, but inevitability. These men were courageous, but courage alone did not win air battles. From the command ship, Ozawa sent the order, "Advance." The formation surged forward like a spear thrust toward the invisible enemy. It would take hours to make contact, and when they did, if they did, they would be met by enemy fighters, already airborne, already waiting, already guided by radar. Still, they flew. The sound of engines Nakajima Sakai radials and Aichi Atsuta inlines formed a droning wall of noise around Abe. The sun was high now. The ocean glowed. Another wave of bombers from Zuikaku and Shokaku joined them from below, climbing slowly, overloaded with ordnance. The air was thin. The planes struggled. Some would turn back before even seeing an enemy. Abe looked at the cockpit instrument panel. His fuel gauge was lower than he preferred. He would have to fight carefully, if he fought at all. He thought of Pearl Harbor, how confident they had been, how precise, how unstoppable they had seemed. Back then, every pilot was experienced. Every bomb found its mark. Every landing was flawless. American carriers, battered but alive, had escaped them. Now those same carriers, reinforced, multiplied, perfected, were hunting them. He thought of Coral Sea, of Midway, of Santa Cruz, battles where elite Japanese air crews had fought brilliantly but suffered losses they could not replace. He had lost friends, mentors, entire squadrons. Now, he flew with their replacements. The sun dipped slightly. Shadows shortened across the Pacific. Somewhere in the distance, American Hellcats were already lifting off, guided by radar, vectored in by controllers who knew exactly where the Japanese force was. Thousands of miles from Japan, Abe led his formation into an airspace controlled not by pilots but by systems. The Great Marianas turkey shoot was about to begin. He felt no fear, only sorrow. When the American fighters struck, they struck from above. They dove through the formations with ruthless precision, using tactics refined through years of combat. Radio discipline held perfectly. Squadrons responded instantly. Japanese torpedo bombers fell first, their formation shattered. Dive bombers spiraled down in smoke and flame. Fighters fought desperately, but their Zeros were no longer unmatched. The American aircraft were faster, armored, heavily armed, and flown by veterans. Abe fought with everything he had. He shot down 2 aircraft. He nearly downed a third before his ammunition ran out. He broke away, diving for altitude he could not regain. As he turned toward his carrier, he looked back at the sky that had once belonged to him. That day, Japan lost more than planes. It lost its last chance to control the Pacific. It lost the skies. And with that, the war. The formation turned east toward the American fleet. Intelligence reported 15 enemy carriers operating approximately 300 miles away. Abe did quick calculations as he led his group toward the target. 15 American carriers, each carrying perhaps 60 aircraft, like Japanese fleet carriers. Maybe 900 aircraft total. The Americans would be outnumbered today. Japan would achieve the decisive victory that had eluded them since Midway. 2 hours later, Abe's formation encountered something that shattered every assumption he had made about American naval aviation. The sky over the American fleet erupted with defending fighters. Not dozens, not hundreds, hundreds and hundreds. Grumman F-6F Hellcats rose in waves from the American carriers, more fighters than Abe had seen in his entire career. His strike force, which had seemed so massive at launch, was being systematically destroyed by fighter squadrons that appeared inexhaustible. For every American fighter shot down, 3 more seemed to take its place. Abe's radio filled with desperate calls from bomber pilots as Hellcats tore through the formation. By the time his surviving aircraft straggled back to their carriers, 243 Japanese planes had been shot down. Only 29 American aircraft were lost. The slaughter would be remembered as the Great Marianas turkey shoot. But for Abe and the surviving Japanese aircrews, the battle revealed something more shocking than their defeat. As they flew past the American task force, they counted the carriers below. 15 flat-tops, as intelligence, had reported. But the number of aircraft these ships had launched was impossible, according to everything Japanese naval doctrine taught about carrier operations. American carriers were putting aircraft into the sky at rates that exceeded Japanese carrier capacity by factors of 2 or 3. Each American fleet carrier appeared to operate 90 to 100 aircraft. The newer ships seemed to carry even more. This was not supposed to be possible. Japanese naval architects and aviation planners had spent 2 decades developing carrier doctrine based on carefully calculated relationships between ship size, aircraft complement, and operational effectiveness. Their carriers had been designed to optimal specifications, yet somehow American carriers of similar displacement were operating air groups half again as large as Japanese carriers, sometimes larger. The implications were devastating. If each American carrier could launch 2 to 3 times as many aircraft as intelligence had estimated, then the carrier balance in the Pacific was not what Japanese planners believed. The strategic calculations that had guided Japan's naval war for 3 years were built on false assumptions. The reality was even worse than Lieutenant Commander Abe realized in June 1944. The disparity between Japanese and American carrier aircraft capacity had existed from the war's beginning. Japanese naval intelligence had consistently underestimated American carrier capabilities because they could not conceive that their own careful carrier designs might be fundamentally flawed. The divergence began in the 1920s when both nations started building their first purpose-designed aircraft carriers. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 had limited carrier tonnage for the United States and Japan. Under treaty restrictions, the United States Navy could build carriers totaling 135,000 tons. The Imperial Japanese Navy received 81,000 tons of carrier tonnage. Both navies approached the carrier problem as engineering puzzles. How much flight deck length was needed for aircraft operations? How large must hangars be to store aircraft effectively? What armor protection would carriers require against enemy attack? How fast must carriers steam to launch and recover aircraft while keeping pace with battle fleets? Japanese designers at the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal created elegant solutions to these questions. Carrier Akagi, converted from a battlecruiser hull under treaty restrictions, commissioned in 1927. After major modifications in 1938, she displaced 42,000 tons, could make 31 knots, and operated 60 aircraft. Her design philosophy emphasized aircraft quality over quantity. Each aircraft received dedicated maintenance space in enclosed hangars. Launch and recovery operations followed strict procedures that prioritized safety and efficiency. Carrier Kaga, converted from a battleship hull, commissioned in 1928 and was similarly rebuilt by 1935. She displaced 43,000 tons, made 28 knots, and operated 60 to 70 aircraft. Both ships had been designed with 2 or 3 hangar decks to maximize aircraft storage within their hulls. The Americans took a different approach. USS Lexington and USS Saratoga, converted from battlecruiser hulls under the same treaty restrictions, each displaced 43,000 tons. But while Japanese designers had created ships that operated 60 aircraft, the American carriers operated 90 aircraft from their commissioning in 1927. The difference came from fundamental design philosophy. American carrier designers at the Bureau of Construction and Repair had concluded that aircraft capacity should be maximized at every opportunity. They built larger hangars with higher overhead clearance. They accepted tighter aircraft spacing. They developed deck parking procedures that allowed aircraft to be stored on the flight deck rather than exclusively in hangars. Japanese designers considered deck parking dangerous and inefficient. Their carriers recovered all aircraft into enclosed hangars before preparing the next launch. This procedure was safer, cleaner, and more controlled, but it limited aircraft capacity to what could be stored in the hangars. American carriers recovered aircraft, struck them below to the hangar, then immediately brought up additional aircraft to park on deck. This deck parking, called deck load strikes by American aviators, could effectively increase a carrier's aircraft complement by 30 to 50%. The technique was considered sloppy by Japanese naval aviators who had trained under strict peacetime safety procedures. Through the 1930s, Japanese naval expansion produced some of the finest aircraft carriers ever built. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Soryu and Hiryu, commissioned in 1937 and 1939, represented the pinnacle of Japanese carrier design. These ships displaced 18,000 tons, could make 34 knots, and operated 57 to 73 aircraft. They were fast, maneuverable, and beautifully engineered. Their aircraft, including the A6M Zero fighter and D-3A Val dive bomber, were superior to anything American carriers operated in 1941. Japanese carrier doctrine emphasized aircraft quality and pilot skill. Each pilot underwent years of rigorous training before carrier qualification. The pilots who attacked Pearl Harbor represented the most elite naval aviation force ever assembled. Their aircraft were better. Their training was superior. Their combat experience from operations in China exceeded anything American naval aviators had known. The combination seemed unbeatable. Shokaku and Zuikaku, Japan's newest fleet carriers, commissioned in 1941. These ships incorporated all lessons learned from earlier designs. They displaced 32,000 tons, made 34 knots, and operated 84 aircraft. Japanese naval planners considered these ships equal to any carrier afloat. Intelligence reports suggested American carriers operated approximately 60 aircraft, slightly less than Japanese fleet carriers. The calculations seemed favorable for Japan as war approached. What Japanese intelligence failed to understand was that American carriers were already operating significantly larger air groups through techniques Japanese designers had rejected. USS Yorktown, Enterprise, and Hornet, commissioned between 1937 and 1941, each officially operated 80 aircraft. But in practice, these ships routinely sailed with 90 to 100 aircraft through aggressive deck parking. The technique involved landing aircraft, striking some below to the hangar, and parking others on the flight deck. Aircraft were spotted with wings folded, positioned with minimal clearance between planes. The flight deck became a storage area as much as a landing surface. This approach seemed chaotic to Japanese observers who witnessed it before the war. Their own procedures called for clearing the flight deck completely between operations. American pilots landing on carriers packed with parked aircraft had to dodge between planes and catch arresting wires with less margin for error. But the payoff was operational flexibility. An American carrier could launch massive strikes by simply starting up the aircraft already spotted on deck, while simultaneously preparing additional aircraft in the hangar below. December 7th, 1941 brought war, but not immediate revelation of the carrier aircraft disparity. At Pearl Harbor, Japanese carriers launched their full-air groups in 2 waves, 189 aircraft in the first wave, 167 in the second wave. The attacks devastated the American Pacific Fleet. Japanese pilots reported complete surprise and overwhelming success. The attack confirmed everything Japanese naval doctrine taught about carrier aviation. Concentrated strikes launched by elite pilots flying superior aircraft could achieve decisive results. But Pearl Harbor taught the Americans lessons that would reshape their carrier doctrine. The raid demonstrated what concentrated carrier air power could achieve. More importantly, it showed American planners that they needed more aircraft per carrier to generate overwhelming striking power. If Japanese carriers could launch nearly 200 aircraft in a single strike, American carriers needed capacity to match or exceed these numbers. The solution was not building bigger carriers, but operating more aircraft from existing carriers. In early 1942, the Navy Department authorized increasing air group sizes across all fleet carriers. Yorktown-class carriers that had operated 80 aircraft in peacetime began sailing with 90 to 100 aircraft. The new Essex-class carriers under construction were designed to operate 100 aircraft operationally, with provisions for potentially carrying more through intensive deck parking. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 should have revealed the aircraft capacity disparity to Japanese intelligence. American carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown launched strikes totaling over 200 aircraft against the Japanese mobile force. The Japanese committed 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, with total air groups of approximately 250 aircraft. The Americans, with 3 carriers, nearly matched the Japanese 4-carrier air strength. But Midway's chaos and confusion obscured the implications. Japanese commanders attributed their defeat to bad luck and poor timing rather than structural disadvantages in carrier design. The loss of 4 irreplaceable fleet carriers forced Japan to reconsider carrier construction priorities, but not carrier design philosophy. Through late 1942 and early 1943, both sides recovered from the brutal carrier battles at Coral Sea and Midway. Japan laid down new carrier construction, including converted Junyo-class ships and purpose-built Unryu-class fleet carriers. These ships followed proven Japanese design principles with aircraft complements of 50 to 70 aircraft. American shipyards began mass production of Essex-class fleet carriers, with the lead ship USS Essex commissioning in December 1942. These ships displaced 33,000 tons, made 33 knots, and were designed to operate 100 aircraft. But design capacity and operational reality diverged dramatically. Essex-class carriers routinely sailed with 110 to 120 aircraft through aggressive deck parking. This was achieved through several innovations Japanese designers had not considered. The Essex class had larger flight decks, measuring 872 feet in length and 150 feet in width. More importantly, American designers had created more efficient aircraft storage through better hangar layouts and higher overhead clearance. Japanese carriers typically had hangar heights of 16 to 18 feet. This clearance was adequate for the aircraft of the 1930s, but became restrictive as aircraft grew larger through the war. American carriers had hangar decks with 17.5 feet of overhead clearance, just enough additional height to allow more flexible aircraft arrangement. The real innovation was in deck parking doctrine. By 1943, American carriers had developed elaborate procedures for parking aircraft on every available square foot of flight deck space. Maintenance crews learned to service and arm aircraft while they were deck parked. Ordnance handlers loaded bombs and torpedoes on planes, spotted on deck rather than exclusively in the hangar. This deck load strike concept meant that carriers could prepare massive strikes without clearing the flight deck. Japanese carriers required clearing the deck before launching because their operational doctrine viewed the flight deck purely as a runway. American carriers treated the deck as active workspace where multiple operations occurred simultaneously. By mid-1943, an Essex-class carrier could launch 75 to 90 aircraft in a single strike, then recover them, rearm them, and launch a second strike, all while maintaining combat air patrols and search missions. Japanese carriers launching a maximum effort strike of 60 to 70 aircraft had to recover all aircraft before preparing the next mission. The operational tempo difference was profound. The Battle of the Russet, Philippine Sea in June 1944, finally demonstrated to Japanese commanders what their intelligence services had failed to recognize for 3 years. Admiral Ozawa's mobile fleet committed 9 carriers to battle, 5 fleet carriers, and 4 light carriers with approximately 470 aircraft total. Task Force 58, under Admiral Mark Mitchell, included 7 Essex-class fleet carriers and 8 light Independence-class carriers, 15 carriers total. Japanese intelligence estimated these ships carried perhaps 700 to 800 aircraft. The actual number was approximately 950 aircraft. When Ozawa launched his first strike wave of 69 aircraft on June 19th, American radar detected them 150 miles out. Task Force 58 launched 250 fighters to intercept. The Americans could afford to dedicate 1/4 of their total air strength purely to defense while maintaining attack, capabilities, search missions, and reserves. The Japanese strike force was annihilated. Only 27 aircraft returned to their carriers. Ozawa launched 3 more strike waves throughout the day. Each was intercepted by overwhelming numbers of American fighters. By day's end, Japan had lost approximately 300 aircraft. American losses totaled 29 aircraft in combat, mostly to anti-aircraft fire when strike forces attacked the Japanese fleet. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot demonstrated the mathematical reality of the carrier-aircraft disparity. Japanese carriers, even when achieving complete surprise and ideal attack conditions, could not generate sufficient striking power to overcome American defenses. American carriers could maintain massive combat air patrols, conduct offensive strikes, and still retain substantial reserves. The disparity was not just in aircraft numbers, but in operational flexibility. Japanese carriers following strict launch and recovery procedures could not match the tempo of American carriers that operated aircraft from both hangars and flight decks simultaneously. After the Philippine Sea battle, Japanese naval intelligence finally compiled accurate assessments of American carrier capabilities. The reports were shocking. Each Essex-class carrier operated 100 to 120 aircraft, approximately double the aircraft complement of Japanese fleet carriers. The newer Midway-class carriers under construction in American yards would operate 130 to 145 aircraft. These were not escort carriers or second-line vessels. These were front-line fleet carriers with armor protection, 33-knot speed, and combat capabilities equal to Japanese carriers in every respect except that they carried twice as many aircraft. The strategic implications were crushing. In June 1944, Japan operated approximately 600 carrier aircraft total across all remaining operational carriers. The United States Navy had approximately 1,500 carrier aircraft in the Pacific, with more carriers joining the fleet monthly. American shipyards were commissioning Essex-class carriers at a rate of 1 per month. By war's end, 24 Essex-class carriers would be completed. Japan could not possibly build carriers fast enough to compensate for the aircraft capacity advantage American carriers possessed. Even if Japanese shipyards could match American production rates, which they could not, their carriers would still operate 50 to 70 aircraft, while American carriers operated 100-plus aircraft. The mathematical disparity was insurmountable. Japanese naval architects finally understood why American carriers achieved such operational effectiveness. The design philosophy that had seemed crude and unsafe, the deck parking that appeared sloppy, the crowded flight decks that violated Japanese safety procedures, all of these techniques maximized aircraft capacity without requiring larger ships. American carriers achieved through operational doctrine what Japanese designers had assumed required increased displacement and construction time. The implications extended beyond immediate combat effectiveness. Aircraft carrier capacity determined how many pilots and aircrew could deploy to combat zones. American carriers transporting 120 aircraft brought 120 pilots, plus an equivalent number of radiomen, gunners, and enlisted aviation specialists. Japanese carriers transporting 60 aircraft deployed half as many trained personnel to combat zones. The United States Navy could train, equip, and deploy aviators at twice the rate of the Imperial Japanese Navy using the same number of carriers. This mathematical advantage compounded throughout the war as losses accumulated. By late 1944, Japan faced pilot shortages more severe than aircraft shortages. Experienced aviators had been killed in the Solomons, at Rabaul, in the Philippine Sea. Training commands could not replace losses fast enough. When replacement pilots did reach operational units, they had far less training than the elite aviators of 1941. The carrier aircraft disparity meant American carriers could deploy twice as many pilots to gain combat experience, accelerating American pilot quality improvement, while Japanese pilot quality declined. Japan attempted to compensate through several desperate measures. In late 1944, naval planners proposed converting additional ships to carriers. Battleships Ise and Hyuga were modified with flight decks aft of their main gun turrets. These hybrid battleship carriers were supposed to operate 22 aircraft, providing additional air power without dedicating full carrier hulls. The conversions were completed, but proved operationally useless. The flight decks were too small for effective operations. The ships operated as battleships that happened to have aviation facilities. Submarine tender Taige was converted to light carrier Ryuho in 1942. Several additional merchant conversions produced light carriers Shinyo, Kaio, and Shimano. These desperate conversions added carrier hulls to the fleet, but could not overcome the fundamental aircraft capacity disadvantage. Even if Japan had commissioned 50 carriers, Japanese design philosophy would have limited each to 60 to 70 aircraft, while equivalent American carriers operated 100-plus aircraft. The United States Navy also recognized that more carriers meant more flexibility. The Essex-class construction program eventually produced 24 carriers, not because 24 were needed simultaneously, but because large numbers of adequate carriers were more valuable than small numbers of perfect carriers. This represented the same design philosophy that created escort carriers from merchant hulls. American naval planning emphasized quantity and availability over theoretical perfection. Japanese naval planning remained focused on ship quality and individual unit excellence, even as the war demonstrated that overwhelming numbers could defeat superior individual capabilities. The fundamental design difference came down to acceptable risk. Japanese carriers protected aircraft in enclosed hangars because this minimized fire risk and weather damage. Deck parking exposed aircraft to the elements and increased fire danger if the ship was hit. American carriers accepted these risks to maximize aircraft capacity. The decision proved correct. Japanese carriers suffered catastrophic losses at Midway when bombs penetrated to hangars packed with fueled and armed aircraft. American carriers that practiced deck parking could jettison deck-parked aircraft overboard if necessary, clearing the flight deck and reducing fire risk. At the Battle of Santa Cruz in October 1942, carrier Hornet was hit by bombs and torpedoes, while her flight deck was crowded with aircraft. Damage control parties pushed burning aircraft overboard to contain fires. The carrier eventually sank, but the deck parking that Japanese designers considered dangerous had actually provided a buffer of expendable aircraft that protected internal spaces. The crew had more time to fight fires because flames initially consumed deck-parked aircraft rather than immediately penetrating to the hangar. By 1945, the carrier aircraft disparity had become absolute. American fast carrier task forces operated with 12 to 16 Essex-class carriers, each with over 100 aircraft. These task forces could launch strikes of 300 to 500 aircraft against targets throughout the Western Pacific. Japan's surviving carriers rarely sortied because they lacked sufficient aircraft and trained pilots to operate effectively. The few remaining Japanese carriers were used primarily as aircraft transports, shipping planes from Japan to island bases. They could not risk combat operations against American task forces that would swarm them with overwhelming numbers. The final Japanese carrier operation occurred in April 1945, when Yamato's suicide mission to Okinawa included several surviving carriers as diversionary forces. The carriers launched their handful of remaining aircraft, then turned back to Japan. They never engaged American forces directly. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 had already demonstrated that Japanese carriers without aircraft were merely targets. Admiral Ozawa's carrier force served as bait to lure American carriers north, while Japanese battleships attacked the landing beaches. The decoy force included 4 carriers with approximately 116 aircraft total. When American Task Force 38 found Ozawa's carriers, they launched repeated strikes that sank all 4 carriers while losing fewer than 20 aircraft in return. The lopsided kill ratio reflected not just American pilot superiority, but the fundamental aircraft capacity advantage that allowed American carriers to overwhelm defenses through sheer numbers. In post-war interrogations, Japanese naval officers repeatedly mentioned their shock at American carrier aircraft capacity. Admiral Ozawa stated that intelligence reports indicating 60 to 70 aircraft per American carrier had been proven disastrously wrong. He had planned the Philippine Sea battle, assuming 15 American carriers meant approximately 900 to 1,000 aircraft. The actual number, approximately 1,500 aircraft, had made his battle plan unworkable before a single aircraft launched. Japanese carrier designers interviewed after the war explained that their design philosophy had prioritized what they considered proper carrier operations. Aircraft belonged in protected hangars when not flying. Deck parking was considered an emergency procedure, not standard practice. The idea of routinely operating carriers with aircraft permanently deck parked seemed unprofessional. American designers had abandoned professional standards to achieve numerical advantage. The critique was accurate, but missed the strategic point. Wars were not won by professional standards but by effectiveness. American carriers might have looked messy to Japanese observers, with aircraft crammed onto every available space. But they could launch twice as many aircraft as Japanese carriers. In carrier warfare, aircraft capacity translated directly to combat power. A carrier that could launch 100 aircraft was twice as effective as a carrier that could launch 50 aircraft. The United States Navy had grasped this fundamental truth early. Their willingness to accept crowded flight decks, complicated deck operations, and increased fire risk brought them insurmountable advantage in the Pacific War. The Japanese had built beautiful carriers operated by elite pilots following professional procedures. The Americans had built adequate carriers operated by adequately trained pilots following pragmatic procedures that maximized aircraft capacity. The pragmatic approach won. The legacy of the carrier aircraft disparity extended beyond World War II. Post-war carrier design incorporated American deck parking concepts universally. The British Royal Navy, which had developed armoured flight decks that limited aircraft capacity, adopted American-style deck parking after observing its effectiveness. Soviet carrier designs, when they eventually emerged in the Cold War, included provisions for deck parking additional aircraft. The Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force, recreated in the 1950s, studied American carrier operations extensively and adopted deck parking procedures for their helicopter carriers. The fundamental lesson was simple. Maximum aircraft capacity within reasonable displacement limits provided more combat effectiveness than perfect accommodation for smaller air groups. Modern supercarriers, including the Nimitz and Ford classes, carry 75 to 90 aircraft, fewer than World War II Essex-class carriers. But modern carrier aircraft are vastly larger and more capable than World War II planes. The F/A-18 Super Hornet has an empty weight of 32,000 pounds compared to 10,000 pounds for a World War II F-6F Hellcat. A modern carrier with 75 aircraft has more striking power than a World War II carrier with 120 aircraft because each aircraft is so much more capable. But the design philosophy remains unchanged. American carriers maximize aircraft capacity within practical limits through aggressive deck parking and efficient hangar utilization. For the Japanese naval aviators who fought through the Pacific War, the carrier aircraft disparity remained their most bitter discovery. They had been told their carriers were equal or superior to American carriers. They had been trained to believe that superior pilot skill and aircraft quality would overcome any numerical disadvantage. The mathematical reality, revealed in combat, was that American carriers operated 2 to 3 times as many aircraft as Japanese carriers of equivalent displacement. No amount of pilot skill could overcome such numerical disparity. The final statistics told the story. From 1941 through 1945, the United States Navy commissioned 98 carriers, including 24 Essex-class fleet carriers and 64 escort carriers. Japan commissioned 17 carriers during the war. American carriers operated approximately 100 aircraft per fleet carrier and 30 aircraft per escort carrier. Japanese carriers operated 50 to 80 aircraft per ship. The mathematical advantage compounded across time. By mid-1944, American carriers could launch strikes that outnumbered entire Japanese carrier air groups. The young pilots who had flown from Zuikaku in June 1944, who had witnessed American fighters rising in seemingly endless waves, understood what the statistics meant. They were fighting an enemy that could afford to lose 3 aircraft for every Japanese plane shot down and still overwhelm defenses through sheer numbers. Lieutenant Commander Abe survived the Philippine Sea battle. He survived the defense of the Philippines. He survived until March 1945, when his unit transitioned to kamikazes. He flew his last mission from a land base in Kyushu, diving his Zero into a destroyer off Okinawa. His carrier, Zuikaku, had been sunk at Leyte Gulf in October 1944. The ship that had launched him against Pearl Harbor, that had survived Coral Sea and the Philippine Sea, was overwhelmed by American carrier aircraft at Leyte. She took multiple bomb and torpedo hits from over 300 American aircraft. She capsized and sank, taking 843 crew members with her. In that moment, a flagship disappeared beneath the waves, and with it, a naval doctrine, a philosophy of design, and an empire's belief in its maritime supremacy. The carrier that could operate 84 aircraft had been destroyed by carriers that routinely put 120, sometimes even more, into the air. It was not just a battle, it was a revelation. The disparity, discovered too late and never overcome, had determined the Pacific War's outcome before the first shot was fired. American carriers could put more aircraft in the sky. They could do so more quickly, more frequently, and more sustainably than their Japanese counterparts. That numerical advantage, sustained across 4 relentless years of combat, proved insurmountable. The admirals who had designed Japan's elegant carriers never imagined that cramming aircraft onto flight decks in what seemed like disorganized chaos could be the winning doctrine. They believed in symmetry, efficiency, and technical perfection. They believed that every airplane should have an exact place, every maintenance cycle an ideal timing, every aircraft perfectly serviced in a hangar protected from the elements. Their carriers were masterpieces of order, streamlined hangar decks, enclosed maintenance facilities, and meticulously planned operations. American carriers looked sloppy by comparison. Photographs taken before major operations often showed aircraft packed wingtip to wingtip on the flight deck, lashed down under the sun, and salt spray, stuffed onto every available inch of deck space. Japanese officers studying these images shook their heads. To them, it was amateurish, ill-disciplined, even absurd. But what the Americans lacked in elegance, they made up for in raw operational capacity. It turned out that aircraft didn't need pristine hangars to function. They didn't need ideal conditions. They needed fuel, ammunition, pilots, and a place to take off. American flight deck crews, many of them farmhands, machinists, mechanics, and factory workers in civilian life, quickly learned to operate in this new environment of controlled chaos. They rolled out a new concept, unintentionally revolutionary: deck parking. Instead of keeping aircraft in the hangar until needed, they kept them on the flight deck all the time. Instead of preserving perfect order, they optimized for speed. Instead of aiming for sophistication, they pursued volume. Volume won wars. The result was transformative. An American carrier could launch nearly its entire air group in minutes. A Japanese carrier often needed twice the time to launch half the number of aircraft. And as the war progressed, this gap only widened. In a naval war where the side that struck first and hardest usually won, speed and quantity became everything. Japan discovered this too late. At Midway, the Japanese carriers still operated under the assumption that time was abundant. They cycled, aircraft mechanically. Refuel, rearm, restow, relaunch. The American carriers launched their planes the moment they could fly. No perfection, just production. That one doctrinal difference became a death sentence. But the truth ran deeper still. American carriers did not win simply because they put more aircraft in the air. They also put them there more often, with more fuel, with more ordnance, with more durability. They had deeper magazines, larger fuel tanks, and better crew rotation practices. Their engines were reliable. Their deck crews were trained for damage control, fire suppression, and repair under fire. Their pilots were replaced, retrained, and rotated with astonishing speed. Japan's carriers were elegant, fast, and beautifully engineered, but they were fragile. Their fuel lines were not armoured. Their hangars were enclosed, trapping heat and flames when explosions occurred. Their firefighting systems were inadequate. Their crews were highly trained, but irreplaceable. Every Japanese carrier lost in battle was not just a ship gone, but a generation of professionals wiped out. Every American carrier damaged could be patched, repaired, and sent back. And even when carriers were sunk, their crews largely survived, and the experience they gained lived on. Japan could not match that resilience. Above all, the Americans mastered what the Japanese did not fully understand. Carrier aviation was not just about ships, or even aircraft. It was about systems. A carrier was not merely a floating airfield. It was a living organism. It needed logistics, infrastructure, training, replacement, support, flexibility, and improvisation. Everything had to flow together. Everything had to adapt. Japan's system was rigid, efficient, and elegant when everything went according to plan. America's system was chaotic, resource-heavy, and adaptable when nothing went according to plan. And so, when American dive bombers screamed out of the clouds, when torpedo bombers attacked in waves that seemed endless, when fighter cover shielded them like a living wall of steel, Japan found itself staring at a force that could not be matched by brilliance alone. It could only be matched by numbers. Numbers Japan did not have. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, this imbalance reached its peak. Japanese pilots, many with only minimal training, were sent against experienced American aviators, backed by radar control, combat air patrols, and more deck-launched fighters than Japan could put into the air from all its carriers combined. They were shot down by the hundreds. Entire air groups disappeared. Most never even saw their targets. And on the waters below, American carriers kept launching. Deck crews sprinted. Catapults screamed. The smell of fuel, salt, and burning rubber filled the air as squadron after squadron roared into the sky. Pilots flew 2, sometimes 3 combat sorties in a day. Maintenance. Crews repaired bullet holes with sheet metal and tape. Logistics officers calculated fuel and ordnance at a sprint. Firefighters trained constantly, and still, the launches continued. In the final accounting, the Americans had put nearly 800 aircraft into combat from 15 carriers, an average of more than 50 aircraft per ship in simultaneous operations, and at peak capacity, they could have sent even more. Japan could not comprehend such scale. In Tokyo, analysts pored over battle reports. How were the Americans able to launch so many planes? How were their carriers still fighting even after taking hits? How did they repair damage so quickly? And how did they have more pilots, more planes, more munitions every time? The answer, again and again, pointed to one thing: volume. Not elegance, not supremacy, not brilliance. Volume. The American carriers were factories of war. They were floating air forces. They were adaptable, expandable, repairable, sustainable. They were ugly. They were chaotic. They were masterpieces of practical efficiency, and they were unstoppable. When that Japanese carrier sank, disappearing beneath the waves in a cataclysm of explosions and smoke, it took more with it than steel and souls. It took an idea, the idea that warfare could be won with grace, with perfection, with ideal conditions. It took the belief that beauty and symmetry led to victory. Its final legacy, a reminder that war does not reward elegance but endurance, not perfection but adaptability, not abundance of skill but abundance of capacity. The oceans would swallow the ship, but not the lesson. Today, the wreck rests silently on the Pacific seafloor. Coral grows over the twisted hull. Fish drift through rusted passageways once filled with officers and sailors. Nature, as it always does, reclaims. And above those waters, new carriers, massive, nuclear-powered, steel giants of the modern era, continue to launch aircraft, not from polished hangars, but from open decks crowded with machines. Wingtip to wingtip, engines roaring. Chaos everywhere. But in that chaos, victory. That truth remains unchanged. And it all began with a lesson discovered too late. In war, the side that can launch the most planes wins the sky. And in the Pacific, the side that won the sky won everything. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.